Her husband left his laptop open, and Eleanor Voss saw exactly what he wrote about her to his coworker. She wasn't snooping. She was reaching for a glass of water on the hospital tray table, still groggy from the anesthesia, still in the thin cotton gown they'd given her after the knee surgery, when the screen caught her eye. The email thread was just there, open, addressed to a woman named Danny Marsh, junior associate at Craig's firm, Acquisitions Department. And in the middle of the thread, in Craig's careful, professional font, were these words: "She's never really been the kind of woman who makes you proud to walk into a room. You know what I mean? Soft in a way that reads, 'I've been doing damage control for years.'" Eleanor read it once, then she read it again. Then she set down her water glass with both hands, very carefully, so that it didn't make a sound. What Craig Voss did not know, what Danny Marsh did not know, what his mother Constance had never once thought to wonder, was that the woman in that hospital bed held sole title to 11 commercial properties across the South Memphis corridor, appraised 4 months earlier at $6.8 million, that the annual lease income from those properties exceeded Craig's salary, that 2 of those buildings sat inside a development corridor where Craig's own firm had active clients, and that one of those properties, the one Craig himself had formally declined to acquire in 2021, signing the memo that called it not viable for development, was now the most valuable single asset in the entire portfolio. He had looked directly at what she was worth, and seen nothing worth looking at. This is not just a story about a betrayal discovered on an open screen. It's about what happens when a man spends 21 years failing to ask his wife a single curious question, and what it costs him when the answers finally arrive on a mediation table. If you believe that quiet women are worth paying attention to, hit that like button and subscribe. This channel is for you. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight. Now, to understand what Eleanor did next, we need to go back to a back porch in South Memphis, and a woman named Ruth Pennington, who saw this coming before the wedding invitations were printed. But first, the room. The recovery room at Asheville Regional smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, and the afternoon light came through the blinds in thin, indifferent strips. Eleanor had been awake for perhaps 40 minutes, long enough to remember where she was and why, not long enough to feel like herself yet. Her right knee was wrapped and elevated. Her mouth was dry. She reached across the tray table for the plastic cup of water the nurse, Angela Morris, had left within arm's reach. And that is when she saw the screen. Craig's laptop was open beside the water cup. He had been sitting with her earlier, before the call pulled him into the hallway. He had left it the way people leave things when they are not thinking about the person in the room, carelessly, face up, still illuminated. The email thread was open. The recipient was Danny Marsh. The subject line was blank. Eleanor read it once. Then she read it again. She read it the way you read something that confirms what you have been trying not to know for a very long time. Not with surprise, but with the specific, settling weight of recognition. She closed the laptop. Carefully. The way you close a door you have decided never to open again. Then she lay back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling, and she was very still, and her hands, which had begun to tremble, she pressed flat against the thin hospital blanket until they stopped. What Craig Voss did not know, what Danny Marsh did not know, what his mother Constance had never once paused to wonder, was that the woman in that recovery bed held sole title to 11 commercial properties across the South Memphis corridor, each one registered in Shelby County, Tennessee, under the name Eleanor Ruth Pennington. Not Voss. Pennington. The name on the trust documents, on the lease agreements, on 12 years of separate tax filings that Craig had never seen and never thought to ask about, because it had never occurred to him to ask. The portfolio had been appraised 4 months earlier at $6.8 million. The annual net rental income was $310,000. 2 of the properties sat inside a gentrification corridor where Craig's own firm currently had active acquisition clients, and 1 property, a commercial building on Mallory Avenue in South Memphis that Craig's firm had formally evaluated in 2021 and declined to pursue, a building Craig himself had characterized in a signed memo as not viable for development, carried the highest individual appraisal in the entire portfolio, $890,000. He had looked directly at what she was worth. He had put his professional opinion in writing. And then he had gone home to the woman who owned it and asked her what she wanted for dinner. The audience knows all of this now. Craig will not know any of it until a mediation table in downtown Memphis, 4 months from today. The door opened and Craig came back into the room, his phone already sliding into his jacket pocket, his face arranged into the expression Eleanor had learned to recognize as performed attentiveness. He asked how she was feeling. He adjusted the blanket near her feet without quite touching her. He mentioned that a colleague was covering his afternoon meetings. He said, "Colleague, not Danny, not anyone with a name," and said they should try to get her discharged before the evening traffic. Eleanor looked at him. Not the way she had looked at him this morning, before the laptop, when she might still have been searching his face for something she used to find there. She looked at him the way you look at something you are finally seeing clearly, without the film of hope distorting the shape of it. She said she was ready to go home. Constance arrived 20 minutes before the discharge paperwork was complete, which was exactly like Constance. She came with a paper bag of tulips in the wrong color and a series of observations framed as concern. She noted that Eleanor's color was still quite poor. She wondered aloud whether Eleanor was getting enough sleep, in the particular way that made sleep sound like a personal failing. She told Craig he looked tired, then turned to Eleanor and said she hoped Eleanor wasn't wearing him out with the recovery. She said it warmly. She always said everything warmly. Eleanor signed the discharge forms. She handed them to the nurse. She did not look at Constance while Constance spoke, but she heard every word, and she filed each one in the same careful internal place where she had been filing things for 3 years. In the car, Craig talked. He talked about a client meeting that had gone long, about a property deal in Buncombe County that was close to closing, about a dinner he'd been invited to that he thought might be useful for his practice. Eleanor watched the city move past the window. The light was changing. The mountains sat at the edge of everything the way they always did, enormous and indifferent and still. She thought about a wide oak table in her kitchen. She thought about the handwriting in the margins of a property ledger she'd read so many times she could recite the entries from memory. She thought about a back porch in Memphis, and a glass of sweet tea going warm in the afternoon heat, and a voice that had known, long before Eleanor did, exactly what kind of education she was going to need. They pulled into the driveway. Craig helped her inside, efficiently, without tenderness, and then his phone buzzed and he was already moving toward the stairs, already somewhere else, already gone in the way he had been gone for a long time before Eleanor had a name for it. She stood alone in the kitchen. The oak table sat where it always sat, wide and steady and worn smooth along the edges from 40 years of Ruth's hands. Eleanor crossed the room and stood before it and placed both palms flat against the surface, and she held them there, and she breathed. The table did not move. It never did. That was the thing about what Ruth had built. It did not move. She stood at that table for a long time after Craig went upstairs, The kitchen was quiet in the way kitchens get late in the day when the cooking is done and the family has scattered, a particular hollow quiet that Eleanor had learned to live inside without letting it hollow her out. She ran her thumb along the edge of the oak table, following the grain the way she had done since she was small, when this table had lived in a different house in a different city, and had been covered, most mornings, with property ledgers and county maps and the careful handwriting of a woman who understood that paper was power. Ruth Pennington had understood a great many things that the world around her declined to notice. She was born in 1940 in Shelby County, Tennessee, the daughter of a postal worker and a seamstress. And she grew up watching her parents negotiate a city that had very clear opinions about which of its citizens were permitted to accumulate things. She watched the opinions. She took notes. And when she was 31 years old, newly widowed, with a small insurance settlement and a child to raise, she did the thing that no one in her position was supposed to do. She bought a building. It was a commercial property on Mallory Avenue in South Memphis, a 2-story brick structure that had housed a dry goods store before the neighborhood turned over, and the neighborhood turned over because the banks decided it had. And once the banks decided, the businesses followed. And once the businesses followed, the prices followed them down to nothing. The building sold for $11,000 in 1971. Nobody else wanted it. Ruth wanted it. Ruth had been watching that block for 2 years. She bought it, found a tenant, collected the rent, and said almost nothing to almost anyone. Over the next 4 decades, she did this 10 more times. She was not reckless. She was not impulsive. She was a woman who understood that the corridors everyone else was writing off were simply corridors that hadn't been waited on long enough. And she had the particular patience of someone who has learned that most people's attention span is shorter than a good investment's horizon. By the time Eleanor was born, Ruth owned 6 properties. By the time Eleanor graduated from college, she owned 9. By the time Eleanor married Craig Voss in a ceremony at a Biltmore estate venue in Asheville, North Carolina, Ruth Pennington owned 11 commercial properties outright, with no debt, and a combined appraised value that would have stunned every person in that wedding reception if they had known to ask. Nobody asked. That was also something Ruth had understood about the world. The scene softened into something quieter when Eleanor thought about the summer she was 22. The summer before the wedding, sitting on the back porch of that South Memphis house, with a glass of sweet tea going warm in the afternoon heat. Ruth had just returned from closing on a refinancing agreement. A paperwork visit, she'd called it, nothing ceremonious. And she'd settled into her porch chair with the ease of a woman who had been sitting in that particular chair for 30 years and intended to sit in it for 30 more. She had looked at Eleanor for a long moment. Then she said, "Baby, you don't show men what you're worth before they've shown you who they are." Eleanor had laughed a little. She had thought it was advice about marriage, about not seeming too eager, not giving too much away in the early romantic months. She had stored it in the category of grandmother wisdom. Warm, a little old-fashioned, probably right in some general way. She was 22. She didn't yet understand that Ruth wasn't speaking in metaphors. 3 months before that porch conversation, Ruth had sat down with a Memphis estate attorney named Franklin Okafor, Diane's father, as it happened, now retired, and established an irrevocable trust in Eleanor's name alone. Separate property, premarital designation, legally airtight under Tennessee statute, structured so that no future marriage, no future creditor, and no future husband could reach it without Eleanor's explicit consent. Ruth had done this not because she distrusted Craig specifically. She had met Craig once, briefly, and had formed a complete opinion she kept entirely to herself. But because she had been paying attention to the world for 62 years, and she knew what tended to happen to women who held things without documentation. She put everything in writing. That was Ruth's love language. The diagnosis came 2 years after the wedding. Pancreatic cancer, staged late, the particular cruelty of a disease that announces itself only after it has already made its plans. Ruth spent the next 14 months doing 2 things simultaneously: dying on her own terms and completing the legal transfer of every asset in her name into the trust she had established for Eleanor. She was meticulous. She was unhurried. She was, to the last, a woman who understood the difference between urgency and panic. She died in the spring, in her own house, in the bedroom where she had slept for 40 years. Eleanor held her hand at the end. She didn't speak. Neither did Ruth. They had already said the things that needed saying. The estate settled without complication. Eleanor inherited 11 properties, 12 years of accumulated rental income records, and a handwritten ledger with Ruth's notes in the margins, observations about tenants, about market timing, about which city blocks were beginning to move and which were still waiting. Eleanor took the ledger and the oak kitchen table, and almost nothing else. She brought them to Asheville. She put the table in the kitchen and the ledger in a drawer beneath it. And she went back to being a wife and a mother and a woman Craig Voss thought he understood. Here is the thing the audience should hold on to, because Craig never did. In 2021, a developer named Marcus Webb contacted Voss and Aldrin LLP, Craig's firm, about a potential acquisition in the South Memphis corridor, a commercial property on Mallory Avenue. 2 stories, brick construction, strong bones, underperforming tenant mix. Webb wanted Craig's professional assessment. Craig reviewed the area comps, noted the neighborhood's historical instability, and sent a declination memo in his own name recommending against the acquisition. Not viable for development, the memo read. Current market conditions do not support the risk profile. The property was Ruth's building, the first one, the one she had bought for $11,000 in 1971 because no one else could see what she could see. It was appraised that same year, independently, at $740,000. By the time Eleanor's attorney ordered a fresh appraisal 4 years later, it had reached $890,000, the highest single property figure in the entire portfolio. Craig had looked directly at it. He had rendered a professional opinion. He had gone home that evening and eaten dinner across from the woman who owned it, and he had not asked her a single question about her day. A memory surfaced. Eleanor, early in the marriage, telling Craig once, casually, that her grandmother had left her some family property in Memphis. Property in the family. Something in Tennessee. Craig had nodded. He had asked, Eleanor thought, if there was a house involved, whether they might use it for a long weekend. She had said the properties were commercial. He had said, oh, and then the conversation had moved on to something else, and he had never returned to it, not once, in 21 years. He had nodded the way people nod when they have already decided that what they are hearing does not require their full attention. Eleanor had recognized the nod then, and filed it gently in a category she did not yet have a name for. Standing now at the kitchen table, her knee aching in the particular way it had ached for 2 weeks, her hands pressed flat against the wood that Ruth's hands had worn smooth, she thought about that nod. She thought about what it had cost her to misread it as harmless. She thought about the words still sitting on Craig's laptop screen, waiting like a sentence that had already been written but not yet delivered. Soft in a way that reads. She thought. He never asked. And for a long time, Eleanor had mistaken that for peace. The early years of the marriage had their own texture, warm, imperfect, ordinary in the way she had once found comforting. Craig was ambitious and quick-minded, and genuinely funny when he was relaxed. And in those first years he had been relaxed often enough that Eleanor had built her life around the version of him that appeared on Saturday mornings, and long drives, and the occasional evening when work receded, and he became, briefly, simply a man who was glad to be where he was. She had loved him. That is important to say plainly. She had loved him without reservation or strategy, the way Ruth had raised her to love, completely, and with her eyes open even when what she saw was complicated. The change was not an event, it was a direction. It began sometime around year 8, when Craig made partner at Voss and Aldrin, and discovered that the altitude of the position was not as high as he had imagined, and that the view from it required a certain kind of wife, polished, appropriately ambitious by proxy, the kind of woman who could hold a dinner conversation with a developer and leave him feeling confirmed in whatever he already believed about himself. Craig had never said this aloud. He didn't need to. He began to say other things instead. He began to correct her. Not harshly, never harshly, in the early days of it. He would wait until they were alone after a dinner party and mention, with the careful tone of a man doing her a favor, that she had misspoken about something, that her comment had landed oddly, that perhaps next time she might let the conversation move without trying to redirect it. She had taken the corrections as they were offered. As helpfulness, she had adjusted. She had adjusted again. She had kept adjusting until the adjustments accumulated into a posture she barely recognized as her own. Quieter, smaller, less certain of the space her opinions were entitled to occupy. Constance accelerated this without appearing to try. Craig's mother had always been pleasant to Eleanor in the way that certain women are pleasant, with a warmth that has a temperature ceiling, beyond which it does not go. She had never said anything Eleanor could point to directly as cruel. What she said was things like, "Eleanor, you've always had such a comfortable figure. It's lovely that you don't worry about it." What she said was, "Of course Craig handles the financial decisions. He has the professional background for it." What she said at a birthday dinner for Craig's younger brother, gesturing at the spread Eleanor had prepared and brought. "This is very homey, very Eleanor." She smiled when she said it. The table smiled with her. Eleanor passed the bread and said nothing, and catalogued the remark in the place where she kept all the others. The Constance and Craig dynamic was not conspiratorial. It was gravitational. Constance had raised a son who believed his instincts were worth more than other people's expertise, and she continued, in adulthood, to supply the gravitational confirmation that kept that belief in orbit. When Craig dismissed Eleanor's opinions, Constance was the audience that made the dismissal feel like common sense. She didn't have to say anything. She just had to be in the room, nodding at the right moments, asking Craig questions about his work in the tone of someone who expects the answers to be interesting. Then something shifted. Eleanor could not name the precise month it happened, only that at some point she began noticing things she had previously filtered out. Craig's phone, which had always lived face up on the kitchen counter, began living face down. He began leaving rooms to take calls, a habit he had never had before, a habit she had associated with people who had things to manage that the room couldn't know about. He came home from a conference in Nashville in February and was gone again. Shorter distances, local this time, but gone in the same way. He mentioned a name once at dinner. Danny, just the first name, in the context of a deal that had closed well. And then never mentioned it again. Eleanor had heard the absence of the name more clearly than she had heard the name itself. She doubted herself before she doubted him. This is worth saying carefully because it is the part that people who have not been there do not always understand. It was not weakness. It was the accumulated result of years of small corrections, the natural consequence of a marriage that had taught her, in increments too small to object to, that her perceptions required verification before they could be trusted. She told herself Craig was stressed. She told herself the distance was professional. She told herself she was reading into things, seeing patterns and coincidences, being the kind of wife who made problems by looking for them. She made herself smaller. She stopped mentioning the things she noticed. She kept the house, managed the boys' schedules, attended the dinners. She wore the clothes that Constance's comments had quietly guided her toward and away from. She was, to all external appearances, going through a hard time. That was the phrase, she later learned, that Craig had begun using. Eleanor is going through a hard time. He had said it to Constance, who had repeated it with sighing concern to the family friends who occupied the outer ring of their social world. The receipt appeared on a Thursday in October, in the inside pocket of a jacket Craig had asked her to take to the dry cleaner. A dinner for two at Margot, a French restaurant on Peabody Place in downtown Memphis, a city Craig visited for work, a city where, Eleanor now understood, he had other reasons to be. She stood in the kitchen with the receipt in her hand for a long moment. Then she folded it and put it in the pocket of her cardigan and took the jacket to the cleaner as asked. 2 weeks later, she found a second receipt. Hotel Chiska. One night. The date matched a trip Craig had logged as a property consultation in Shelby County. She did not cry. She sat down at the kitchen table, Ruth's table, and she opened her laptop and she typed the name she had heard once at dinner, and not again. Danny Marsh. The LinkedIn profile was public, Junior Associate, Acquisitions Department, Voss and Aldrin LLP. Her photograph showed a woman who carried herself with the particular confidence of someone unaccustomed to not being the most interesting person in a room. Eleanor looked at the photograph for approximately 4 seconds. Then she closed the browser. She didn't confront him. She had thought about why, later, and the honest answer was that confrontation felt like a door she wasn't ready to walk through, not because she was afraid of what was on the other side, but because she needed to understand what she was walking toward before she opened anything. She needed to be certain. She needed to be prepared. She had been raised, after all, by a woman who understood that the difference between acting and reacting was the difference between a strategy and a wound. She started paying attention differently. She began keeping a note in her phone, not a diary, not anything emotional, just dates and times and observations, the specific facts of a life she was beginning to document rather than simply live. The phone face down at dinner. The Tuesday evenings that became standing absences. The way Craig looked at his screen when it lit up, and then placed it out of her sightline without apparent self-consciousness, a habit that had become so routine it had lost all pretense of concealment. She wrote these things down not with hurt, but with the steady hand of a woman who had grown up watching someone take meticulous notes in the margins of a ledger. It was around this time that she overheard Constance, at a Sunday lunch, telling Craig's Aunt Patricia that Eleanor was going through a hard time, that Craig was carrying a lot at home, that it was difficult for a man of his professional caliber to manage so much. Eleanor was in the kitchen when she heard it. She was standing at the sink with her hands in warm water, washing the serving dishes, and the words came through the open archway clearly and without apology. She didn't turn around. She didn't speak. She stood at the sink, and she felt something settle in her chest. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way a foundation settles when it has decided it is done shifting. That night she lay in the dark beside a husband who was allegedly returning late from a client meeting, and she ran through the words she had memorized from his screen. Soft in a way that reads, "Damage control." She held them there, turned them over, examined them from every angle. And then, quietly, she ran Ruth's words through after them. You don't show men what you're worth before they've shown you who they are. She understood now that Ruth had not been speaking about the beginning of things. She had been speaking about this exact moment. The moment when a woman has seen enough, and knows enough, and is finally ready to stop waiting and start counting. The counting had already begun. Eleanor simply hadn't announced it. The retraining conversation happened on a Sunday evening in November, 3 weeks after the hospital, when the knee had healed enough for Eleanor to move through the house without the cane, but still ached at the end of long days in the specific way that reminded her, quietly and persistently, that her body had been through something and was still keeping score. Craig brought it up at the kitchen table after dinner, with the boys upstairs and the dishes done, and the house arranged into the particular configuration of calm that he preferred for difficult conversations. Everything tidy, no witnesses, the exits clear. He said the word carefully. Retraining. He said it the way you say a word you have rehearsed, testing whether it lands as clinical or kind, having decided that clinical was safer. He said their finances couldn't sustain one income indefinitely. He said it was just practical. He said he'd been thinking about it for a while and wanted to have the conversation now, while things were still manageable, before they became a problem. He looked at her with the expression of a man who believed he was doing her a favor. Eleanor looked back at him. Her hands were in her lap. They did not move. She said she understood. She said she would think about it. She said it the way you say something when you have already thought about it completely and have decided that the person across from you does not need to know that yet. 2 days later, Craig arranged the meeting with Gerald Foss. Gerald Foss occupied a modest suite of offices on Merriman Avenue in Asheville, where he had managed the financial records of Craig's professional life for 15 years, with the quiet, unquestioning competence of a man who understood that his job was to organize information, not interrogate it. He was pleasant. He offered Eleanor coffee. He set a folder on the desk between them and walked through the household financial summary with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this presentation before and expected no surprises. The summary was 4 pages. It listed the family home, assessed at $640,000. 2 retirement accounts, Craig's. A joint savings balance of $38,400. The boys' college funds, jointly held. At the bottom of the final page, under the heading Independent Assets, Eleanor's column was blank. Not 0. Blank. As though the question had been considered and the answer had been determined before she sat down. Eleanor looked at the page. She looked at it the way you look at something that is simultaneously insulting and useful. Then she shifted slightly in her chair, as if adjusting for comfort, and under the cover of the desk she opened the camera on her phone and took a clean photograph of the summary. Both pages visible. Gerald Foss's firm name printed clearly at the top. She said the summary was very thorough. Gerald said he was glad it was helpful. Craig said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. The irony which the audience holds and Eleanor holds, and Gerald Foss will never know, is that on the date of that meeting, the rental income from Eleanor Ruth Pennington's 11 properties had deposited $25,833 into a Memphis account that Gerald Foss had never seen, had never been told about, and had never thought to ask about. While he described her as having no independent assets, she held more real property than the assessed value of every item on his 4-page summary combined. She thanked him for his time. She drove home. She put the photograph in a folder on her phone labeled, simply, Records. Constance's dinner happened 10 days later, on a Saturday in late November, in the formal dining room of the house in Kenilworth, where Craig had grown up, and which Constance maintained with the precise, exhausting elegance of a woman for whom appearances were not a performance, but a conviction. The table was set for 8. Eleanor brought a bottle of wine she knew Constance would find acceptable, and a composure she had been building for months. She understood what she was walking into when she saw the seating arrangement. Danny Marsh was placed across the table, 2 seats to Craig's left, introduced during the cocktail hour as a colleague Craig had wanted to include, framed by Constance with the warmth of a woman welcoming a professional acquaintance and the precision of a woman who understood exactly what she was doing. Danny was polished in the way of someone accustomed to being assessed and accustomed to passing. She carried herself with her shoulders back and her attention calibrated, present enough to be engaging, distant enough to maintain plausible neutrality. She shook Eleanor's hand and said it was lovely to meet her. Her grip was brief and professional. Eleanor said it was lovely to meet her too. She meant nothing by it. She filed everything. The dinner moved through its courses. Craig performed the role of attentive host, with the concentration of a man managing multiple variables simultaneously: his wife, his mother, his colleague, the fiction that held them all in the same room without incident. He did not look at Danny when Danny was speaking. He did not look at Eleanor when Eleanor was quiet. He looked mostly at his wine glass, and at the table, and at the middle distance where, Eleanor imagined, the version of events he preferred was playing out smoothly. Then his phone buzzed. He excused himself. Just a moment. Work. Apologies. And stepped slightly back from the table, not far enough to be absent, close enough that his half of the conversation was audible to Eleanor, if not to the full table. A developer, a property inquiry, South Memphis corridor, the man said, a building on Mallory Avenue. He'd heard the market was moving. Craig said he wasn't interested. He said the area didn't support the risk profile. He said it in the tone of a man confident in his professional judgment, and he set the phone down and picked up his fork. Eleanor had not moved. She was looking at her plate. The address the developer had named was 1140 Mallory Avenue. She knew it the way she knew her own handwriting. She had read it in Ruth's ledger so many times that the numbers had their own texture in her memory. It was the first building, the one Ruth had bought in 1971 for $11,000. The one Craig's firm had declined in 2021, the one currently appraised at $890,000. He had just dismissed it again. At her mother-in-law's dinner table, in front of the woman he was having an affair with, without knowing that the woman sitting 2 feet to his right held the deed. The room moved on. Constance refilled glasses and redirected the conversation with the gracious efficiency of a hostess who understood that a good dinner is a managed experience. And then, near the end of the meal, while the dessert plates were being cleared and the conversation had settled into the comfortable territory of Craig's professional prospects, Constance set down her wine glass and said, with the smile of a woman making an observation she had been holding all evening, "Eleanor, we were just saying, and I hope you'll take this in the spirit it's intended, that it might be worth thinking about what you bring to Craig's life going forward. Not in an unkind way, just practically. Craig works so hard, and you've always been so comfortable at home, but the boys are older now, and it might be nourishing, I think is the word, for you to find something that's yours." The table did not go silent. That was the worst part. The conversation continued as though the remark had been perfectly ordinary, which in Constance's world it had been. Danny Marsh looked briefly at her dessert fork. Craig looked at his mother with an expression that was not quite approval, and not quite anything else. Eleanor looked at Constance. She let the words land and sit. She did not correct them. She did not deflect them. She felt her jaw set, just slightly, in the way it had learned to set when she was absorbing something she intended to remember precisely. She said, "Thank you, Constance. That's kind of you to think about." In the car home, Craig told her Constance meant well. He said it in the tone of a closing argument, the tone of a man who had decided the topic was concluded. Eleanor turned her face toward the window and watched the dark streets of Kenilworth scroll past, and she did not answer him. She thought, one building on Mallory Avenue, assessed at $890,000. 10 more properties behind it. $310,000 a year. 12 years of tax returns in a Memphis account. 11 deeds filed in Shelby County under the name Eleanor Ruth Pennington. 11 deeds. Constance could keep the dinner table. Eleanor already had the rest. It was a Tuesday. Craig had gone to bed at 10. His sleep the untroubled sleep of a man who believed the story he was living. Eleanor had listened to the house settle around his breathing, and then she had gotten up, moved quietly down the stairs in the dark, and sat down at Ruth's table. She hadn't turned on the overhead light. The under-cabinet lamp above the counter threw a low, warm glow across the oak surface, enough to read by, enough to think by. The ledger was already out. She had been coming to it more often in recent weeks, not to study it. She knew the numbers well enough by now that they lived in her like a second pulse. But for the same reason, people return to certain rooms. Because the room itself holds something steady. She opened it to the first page and looked at Ruth's handwriting. The entries were precise and unhurried, the columns clean, the annotations in the margins written in the particular shorthand of a woman who had been keeping her own counsel for so long that she had developed her own private language for it. Next to the 1971 entry for 1140 Mallory Avenue, Ruth had written simply, "Waited." Next to a 1989 acquisition on South 3rd Street, she had written, "They'll see it in 10 years." They had. Next to the trust documentation page, near the back, she had written Eleanor's full name, Eleanor Ruth Pennington, underlined once, with nothing else beside it. No annotation needed. The name was the annotation. Eleanor sat with the ledger open, and she let herself be still. Then, carefully, methodically, without drama, she began to list. She did not write anything down. She did not need to. She held each item in her mind the way you hold evidence, not with heat, but with precision. The laptop screen in the hospital recovery room, Craig's words in his careful professional font, the meeting with Gerald Foss, the 4-page summary, the blank column under her name, the retraining conversation at the kitchen table, Craig's rehearsed gentleness, the word itself, retraining, as though she were a system that had become obsolete. Constance's dinner, the seating arrangement, Danny Marsh's brief and calibrated handshake, Constance's voice at the end of the meal, the question about what Eleanor brought to Craig's life going forward, asked warmly, in front of witnesses, while Danny sat 2 seats to Craig's left with her posture arranged into careful neutrality. The phone call at dinner, the developer, the South Memphis corridor, the address she knew better than Craig would ever know he had dismissed. She went through all of it, not with hurt, not with the tightening in her chest that had accompanied these memories for months. Something had shifted, quietly and completely, somewhere between Constance's dinner table and this kitchen, and what she felt now was not pain, but clarity. The specific, uncluttered clarity of a woman who has finished enduring and is ready to document. She was not angry. She had moved through anger somewhere in the long, quiet weeks of paying attention, and what remained on the other side of it was something more useful. She was finished. There is a difference, and the difference matters. Anger wants an audience. What Eleanor felt wanted only a next step. She thought about Ruth. Not the Ruth of the porch scene, not the Ruth of the hospital bed, not the Ruth of the estate paperwork. All of them at once, the full 40 years of her. The woman who had walked through a city that did not extend itself toward her, and had built something anyway, quietly, without announcement, because she understood that announcement was a luxury reserved for people who did not need the element of time. You don't show men what you're worth before they've shown you who they are. Eleanor had been 22 when Ruth said it. She had been 44 when Craig's laptop screen showed her who he was. And now, at the kitchen table at 11:20 on a Tuesday in December, she finally understood what Ruth had really been saying all along. Not, hide yourself. Not, mistrust everyone. But, wait. Wait until you know. Wait until the picture is complete. Wait until the room is ready for what you're about to bring into it. The room was ready. She picked up her phone. The contact was saved without a title, just the initials. D. Okafor. She had saved it that way 4 years ago, when Diane had called to walk her through the trust transfer documents after Ruth's estate closed, and she had never changed it because the plainness of it felt right. Clean. Unpretentious. Entirely Ruth. She typed, "I'd like to formalize everything in my name before we proceed. All of it." She read it once. "Hi." She pressed send. She set the phone face down on the table. She placed both hands flat on the oak surface, the way she had placed them the night she came home from the hospital. The night this had all begun to crystallize into something she could see clearly. The wood was cool and smooth and worn at the edges from decades of use. She held her palms there and she breathed. 53 minutes later, the phone lit up against the table. She turned it over. Diane Okafor. Understood. I'll begin the separation process first thing tomorrow. We're ready when you are. 4 words back. No filler, no warmth, no padding, just the information and the decision in the particular register of a woman who had been waiting for this message for 8 months and had known, when it came, exactly what it meant. Eleanor set the phone down again. She closed the ledger. She placed her right hand flat on the cover, over Ruth's handwriting, over the 40 years of entries and annotations, and the trust page with her name underlined once in blue ink. She did not speak. There was nothing to say. Ruth had already said it years ago on a summer porch, in the specific tone of a woman giving her granddaughter not advice, but an inheritance of a different kind. A way of moving through the world that was patient and precise and unafraid and entirely, completely hers. You don't show men what you're worth before they've shown you who they are. Eleanor had waited. She had watched. She had kept everything and said nothing, and let Craig Voss build his case against himself 1 document at a time. 4 months later, she walked into a mediation suite in downtown Memphis, and she let Ruth's 40 years of patience do what patience, properly held, always eventually does. The mediation suite at Hollings and Cray on South Main Street was a room designed to feel neutral, which meant it felt like nothing. Gray carpet, recessed lighting, a long conference table in pale ash wood, a window overlooking a parking structure. Eleanor had arrived 30 minutes early with Diane Okafor, and they had sat in that room together in near silence while the morning light settled and the building filled around them. Diane had arranged her folders with the economy of motion of someone who had done this many times and found no reason to perform preparation. Eleanor had placed her hands flat on the table and looked at the window and breathed. She was wearing the dark navy dress she had worn to Ruth's funeral. She had not done this deliberately, or at least she had not acknowledged that she was doing it deliberately. But when she had stood in front of her closet that morning in the gray Memphis dawn, her hand had gone to that dress first, and she had put it on without deliberation. And she had understood, as she buttoned it, that some decisions are made below the level of conscious thought by a part of you that simply knows. Craig arrived at 8:52 with his attorney, a man named Warren Gill, who had the precise, unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to mediation rooms and accustomed to winning in them. Craig was dressed in his best charcoal suit. He scanned the room on entry, a habit, professional and instinctive, registered Eleanor and Diane across the table, registered the thin folder in front of Diane that appeared to contain very little, and settled into his chair with the posture of a man who had assessed the situation and found it manageable. He did not look at Eleanor directly. Not yet. The mediator, a woman named Carol Ashford, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and spoke with the flat efficiency of someone paid to be impartial, opened the session at 9 o'clock precisely. She outlined the process. She confirmed both parties understood the voluntary nature of the proceeding. She asked Warren Gill to present the marital asset declaration. Warren Gill slid the document across the table. 4 pages. The family home on Kensington Drive in Asheville, assessed at $640,000. 2 retirement accounts, both in Craig's name. Joint savings of $38,400. The boys' college funds. At the bottom of the final page, under independent assets, Eleanor's column was blank, identical to the column Gerald Foss had prepared 4 months earlier, the same column Eleanor had photographed under a desk, while Gerald Foss explained that the summary was very thorough. Carol Ashford asked Craig to confirm the declaration was complete and accurate to the best of his knowledge. Craig said that it was. The room was quiet for a moment. Diane Okafor opened her folder. She did not speak. She placed the first deed on the table. It was the deed for 1140 Mallory Avenue, South Memphis, Ruth's first building, the one purchased for $11,000 in 1971, the one Craig had declined in 2021 as not viable. The deed was registered in the name Eleanor Ruth Pennington. Not Voss. Pennington. Diane set it in the center of the table with the same deliberate calm she had used to arrange her folders that morning, then placed the second deed beside it. Then the third. She worked without commentary, without theatrics, without looking up. The deeds accumulated across the pale ash surface in a quiet row, each one a separate document, each one bearing the same name, each one filed in Shelby County, each one representing a building that had existed and generated income throughout the entire length of Craig Voss's marriage to the woman sitting across from him. By the 5th deed, Warren Gill had stopped writing. By the 8th, Craig's hands had gone still on the table in front of him. Diane placed the 11th deed. Then she set the tax returns beside them, 12 years, filed separately under Eleanor Ruth Pennington's Social Security number, reflecting annual rental income that Craig's joint returns had never mentioned, and Craig, as the filing spouse, had a specific legal obligation to have known about. Then she placed the appraisal, certified the previous week by a licensed assessor in Shelby County. $6.8 million, current fair market value, total portfolio. Then she reached into the folder one final time. She placed the 2021 acquisition declination memo from Voss and Aldrin LLP on the table. Craig's firm letterhead at the top. Craig's signature at the bottom. In the body of the document, in Craig's own professional language, property at 1140 Mallory Avenue, South Memphis, assessed as not viable for development given current market conditions and historical neighborhood instability. Recommendation: Decline Acquisition. Beside it, Diane placed the individual appraisal for 1,140 Mallory Avenue, $890,000. Craig read the letterhead. He read his own signature. He looked at the address on the deed beside it. He looked at the appraisal figure. The sequence took perhaps 4 seconds, and what happened to his face in those 4 seconds was not anger and not disbelief. It was something slower and more complete than either of those things. It was the expression of a man who has understood, all at once, that the room he is sitting in has been different from the room he thought he was in for a very long time. The room went silent. Not the polite silence of a pause between speakers. The specific silence of a reckoning that has no immediate response. Carol Ashford removed her reading glasses and looked at Craig. She asked him to confirm, for the record, whether he was aware of the property portfolio held by Eleanor Ruth Pennington prior to this morning. Craig said very quietly that he was not. Diane said, without inflection. The income generated by this portfolio over the past 12 years has not appeared on any joint tax filing. As the filing spouse, Mr. Voss bears a specific and documented legal exposure for that omission. We will be addressing that through separate counsel. She paused. We are also prepared to provide documentation related to Mr. Voss's professional conflict of interest, given that 2 properties in this portfolio fall within corridors where his firm has current acquisition clients. Warren Gill said he would like to request a brief recess. Carol Ashford said the session would continue. Something crossed Warren Gill's face then. Not panic, but its professional cousin, the rapid internal recalculation of a man reassessing the weight of everything in the room. He looked at Craig. Craig was looking at Eleanor. He was really looking at her. Not the performative attention of the hospital room, not the managed regard of a man keeping appearances. He was looking at her the way you look at something when you have finally stopped deciding in advance what it is, and the actual shape of it is arriving for the first time. 21 years of marriage, compressed into 4 seconds of genuine perception. Eleanor looked back at him. She held his gaze for exactly long enough. Then she looked down at the documents in front of her and did not look up again. Diane placed the property transfer confirmations in front of Eleanor. 11 pages. Eleanor picked up the pen, a plain black ballpoint, nothing ceremonious, and she signed her name on each line. Slowly, completely. Eleanor Ruth Pennington, 11 times, on 11 pages, in a room that now understood precisely who Eleanor Ruth Pennington was. When she set the pen down, she did not address the mediator. She did not address Warren Gill. She looked at the surface of the table, and she spoke in the register of a woman stating something that has always been true and is simply now being said aloud for the first time. Grandma Ruth knew exactly who you were before you did. Craig did not respond. There was nothing to say that the documents had not already said more precisely. Carol Ashford concluded the session. Warren Gill gathered his papers with the efficiency of a man who had somewhere else to be immediately. Craig stood. He looked once more at Eleanor. A different look. This one without calculation or performance, just the particular devastation of a man who has understood what he destroyed, and understood too late. And then he and his attorney moved toward the door, and the door closed behind them. Eleanor did not watch them go. She straightened the deeds in front of her into a clean stack, edges aligned, and she held them there beneath her hands. And she breathed, and the room was quiet and bright, and Diane Okafor sat beside her without speaking, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done. After a moment, Diane said, "We're done here." Eleanor said, "Yes." They gathered their things without hurry. They were the last ones out. The consequences moved the way consequences do when they are built on documentation, quickly and in every direction at once. Within 10 days of the mediation, the managing partners at Voss and Aldrin LLP had been made aware, through the discovery process, that Craig had filed 11 years of joint tax returns, omitting income from properties in corridors where his firm had active acquisition clients. The Conflict of Interest review opened on a Thursday. By the following Monday, Craig had been asked to step back from his active caseload while the firm's general counsel conducted an assessment. The language was careful and professional and amounted to the same thing it always amounts to when a man's reputation is the primary asset, and the primary asset has been impaired. Danny Marsh submitted her resignation 14 days after the mediation. She did not give a detailed reason. She didn't need to. The architecture of the situation was visible enough to anyone inside the firm who had been paying attention, and enough people had been paying attention. She left quietly, which had always been the one thing she and Eleanor had in common, though they had come to it by entirely different routes. She relocated to a firm in Nashville within the month. What happened after that, Eleanor did not know, and did not seek to know. Constance Voss stopped calling. Not with a conversation, not with a confrontation, not with the kind of formal withdrawal that at least would have acknowledged there was something to withdraw from. She simply ceased. The phone calls that had come every Sunday, the careful inquiries, the warmly delivered observations, the concern performed for an audience of one, stopped arriving, and the silence where they had been was so complete that Eleanor understood it as its own kind of answer. Constance had always been a woman who measured her investments. She had simply recalculated. Craig called once, on a Wednesday evening 6 weeks after the mediation, when Eleanor was in the kitchen helping her younger son, Marcus, with a history project at Ruth's table. She saw the name on the screen. She let it ring. When the voicemail notification arrived, she listened to it once. Alone in the kitchen after Marcus had gone to bed, his voice measured, and without his usual confidence, a man trying to locate the register appropriate for a call he had no framework for making, saying things about conversation and timing and the boys that circled without landing anywhere. She deleted it. Not with satisfaction. With the same quiet efficiency she had used to photograph Gerald Foss's financial summary, to type 4 words to Diane Okafor, to sign her name 11 times on 11 lines. It was simply the next administrative task. She closed the phone and went to bed. The scene softened into something quieter in the months that followed. The boys, Marcus, 16, and her older son, James, 19, and in his first year at the University of Tennessee, settled into the new shape of things with the particular resilience of young people who have been securely held by one parent throughout a dissolution and know, in the way children know things that are never directly said, that the parent holding them is not going anywhere. Eleanor had been the architecture of their daily lives for 21 years. That did not change. If anything, without the performance of a marriage she had been maintaining alongside everything else, she was more present, more available, more herself. She was not triumphant. She was not relieved in the sharp, celebratory way that people on the outside of these things sometimes imagine. What she felt, on the ordinary mornings that accumulated into weeks and then months, was something quieter and more durable than relief. A stillness that was different in quality from the stillness she had carried through the years of the marriage. That stillness had been imposed, the quiet of a woman making herself smaller to fit a space that kept contracting. This one was chosen. It had weight to it. It had room. 6 months after the mediation, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, Eleanor drove to South Memphis. She stood on the sidewalk in front of 1140 Mallory Avenue and looked up at the building the way Ruth had looked at it in 1971. the way Ruth had looked at it in the photograph on Eleanor's phone. Not with sentiment, but with the clear-eyed regard of someone who has already decided what a thing is worth and what it is going to become. The conversion was underway. The architect, a woman named Priya Subramaniam, who had come recommended by Diane, had the permits in order and the contractor on site. The building would be mixed-income housing, 42 units, ground-floor retail, a community room on the top floor that would look out over the corridor Ruth had spent 40 years believing in. It was the first development decision Eleanor had made entirely on her own, in her own name, for her own reasons, and it felt the way she imagined Ruth had felt every time she had signed a deed for a building that no one else could see the value in. She took out her phone. Ruth's photograph was still in her favorites folder. Ruth in 1987, standing on this same sidewalk, in front of this same brick face, not smiling for the camera, but looking at the building the way you look at something you have already decided to keep. Eleanor looked at the photograph for a moment. Then she looked up at the building itself. This story was never really about what Craig Voss failed to see. Men like Craig fail to see things every day, and the world moves on without much ceremony. This story was about what Ruth Pennington built so that her granddaughter would never have to ask anyone's permission to be seen. It was about what a woman can give another woman across time. Not just money, not just property, but a way of understanding where power actually lives, and who actually holds it when the rooms go quiet. It was about patience as a form of love, and documentation as a form of dignity, and the particular freedom that comes not from taking something away from someone else, but from knowing, finally and completely, what belongs to you. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever been the quietest person in a room that underestimated you, if you have ever held something close because you understood the world wasn't ready to see it yet, leave a comment below and tell us what you're thinking tonight. And wherever in the world you're watching from, we're glad you stayed to the end. Eleanor pocketed the phone. She looked up at 1140 Mallory Avenue one final time, at the brick and the windows, and the 40 years of Ruth's patience embedded in the structure of it. She thought, clearly and without performance, in the voice that was both hers and Ruth's. You don't show men what you're worth before they've shown you who they are. She already knew. She had always known. She turned toward the door and walked forward, unhurried, into what came next.